So, when one of my Discord members asked me to make a video about adventure guilds, I thought I'd do a quick rundown of some fantasy examples, maybe explore Eberron's adventure guilds a little, and that would be that. Ha! Little did I know. I went looking for the historical roots of adventure guilds, and that brought up the Condottieri of Italy, and that, my friends, led me down a deep rabbit hole into a whole different world of mercenary companies and betrayal dire. So today, let's talk about adventuring guilds, their sort of historical roots, and how you can use them in a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you like what I do here and you'd like to support me in making more of these videos, you can hit my Ko-fi page down below, where you can buy memberships or leave a once-off donation. Alternatively, I am a fantasy author and you can purchase my books, the Sangwheel Chronicles, on Amazon, a link down below to that as well. Okay, let's get cracking. The Condottieri came to rise during the 14th century in Italy. So first we need to talk about what was going on in Italy during that time. Italy was by no means a unified country at this point of its history. There were city-states that were active during this period. Cities like Naples, Florence, Venice, and then of course the Papal Lands was a very great power during this period of time. Now, the thing about these cities was they had never adopted the feudal system. They instead had a craft system and a merchant system. And as such, they were exceptionally rich cities, much wealthier than the rest of Europe, which was doing basically agriculture using the feudal system, which is not a very efficient economic system. So these city-states had a lot of money, but they did not have a lot of spare manpower. Most of their people were busy making crafts goods. Most of their people were gainfully employed. You couldn't just raise an army by taking, extra labor from the farmlands. There just wasn't that kind of labor to spare. But they did have money. So they started hiring foreign mercenaries, foreign adventurers to fight their wars for them. The most famous of this was probably Sir John Hawkwood, who was an English knight, and he was a very powerful force in the Italian peninsula during the 1360s. He led a mercenary company called the White Company on behalf of the Pope. So the Pope hired him to take part of in these fights. Now, I do want to say here as well, there is this sometimes misconception that the Roman Catholic Church during this period was a monolithic organization, and that what the Pope said was kind of how it went, but this isn't true. And you can see that very clearly actually in the activities of, say, Florence and the Pope during this period. So the Pope declared Florence under interdict and said, the city as a whole is bad, is non-Christian. And Florence said, "Oh, really, you say that, do you? Well, I'll tell you what, we don't recognize your authority, and we're going to hire our own mercenaries, and we're going to run our own church rites." And the people of Florence didn't quite buy this Florentine church, independent from, say, the Roman Catholic Church. So the Florence nobility basically coerced the Roman Catholic clergy into running the Roman Catholic rites despite the interdict. So there was a lot more going on to the relationship between nobility and the clergy than first meets the eye in kind of a brief skim through of history. The Pope's power was not in any way absolute. This was also the time period when you actually had two popes. You had a pope in France who, had the support of the Holy Roman Emperor, and then you had the Pope in Rome who generally had the support of the city-states. And this dispute within the Roman Catholic Church was only resolved much later. If you'd like me to go into that kind of weird proxy war with a religion, let me know in the comments, and I can. Anyway, back to mercenaries. So the Pope hired mercenaries and the city-states hired mercenaries, and there was much shenanigans with these mercenaries. But in due course, the Italian second sons of the nobles and so on were like, this business of being a mercenary is actually quite profitable, and it would probably be better if we were the mercenaries because we understand local politics. So they started forming Italian companies. Now, at first, most of these mercenary companies were pretty lawless. They couldn't really be trusted and so on. But then they started to come companies who had codes of conduct and contracts that they would sign. And in fact, the word condottieri comes from the Italian word for contract. That's what it means. It is a contractor for war, right? And these condottieri armies were quite substantial. They could go up to 5,000, even 10,000 men, which is a non-trivial force, especially for that day and age. Now, these forces sometimes weren't paid. Most famously, the Pope didn't pay Sir John Hawkwood, so instead he gave him rights over a small city. And so John now had a fief here in Italy as a mercenary company. And that became a thing. So you started having mercenary companies that were running parts of the country. And the condottieri really kind of rose to prominence. During their heyday, they were a force to be reckoned with. But then it started to become a case of they became almost friends with each other, and the leaders knew each other, and they kind of got along, and they didn't really want to go to war. So often, instead of actually going to war, they'd engage in these massively complicated maneuvers, almost like war games, and the one who outmaneuvered the other one was counted to have won, and then they'd negotiate terms of surrender, and the noble who hired the condottieri, well, he was just stuck with that outcome, right? It wasn't like he could do anything. He didn't have his own army. And so the condottieri became this real kind of power in Italian politics. This lasted until the nation state started to arise, most specifically the French nation state and the advent of Napoleon and guns and so on. All of this contributed to the eventual decline of the condottieri within Italy as it became more common for nation states to have armies, which of course a mercenary company can't compete with. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of the condottieri. I will leave a link down below to a great book I found on Amazon about the condottieri if you want to investigate more. It's a very short little novel, only about an hour listening on Audible, so highly recommend if you're interested in exploring condottieri more deeply. I think it's pretty obvious where George R.R. Martin's inspiration for his mercenary companies came from. It was definitely the condottieri that inspired him. If you look at the Golden Company, the Second Sons, it's there in the names, it's there in their knighthoods, it's there in the way that they're organized, their reputations, etc., etc. So you can certainly use the condottieri as an inspiration for how mercenary companies might work within your society. But how do you get from mercenary companies to adventurers? And why did I say that they might be the historical roots of the Adventurer Guild? Well, for that, I want to turn to Catherine Kerr and her silver daggers. So, Catherine Kerr's silver daggers were first a mercenary company. Now, I need to explain here that these mercenary companies were extremely common during a period of time when the throne of Devery, the throne of the kingdom in which the stories are set, was empty. And you had mercenary companies who would hire themselves out to various barons and dukes and so on, all of whom were making war and vying for the throne. Now, the Silver Dagger Mercenary Company was such a company, and they had lost a fight. And they were down to like 15 men, and they weren't doing that great, and so on. And so their leader decided to come up with this idea for how to cheer them up. And he had a dwarven smith manufacture for each of them a silver dagger, a literal silver dagger. And this gave them a sort of sense of pride and identity. Okay, cool. So this would just have been a mercenary company. But during this period where you had this whole like wartime situation and empty throne, the main mage of the Devery Kingdom came up with a cunning plan to solve this empty throne problem, and that was to have a chosen king. Except he wasn't going to bother to wait for the gods or the spirits or anyone else to choose a king. He was going to pick himself a royal brat, make sure that that kid had a good education, and just provide all the omens that he needed to provide by using magic. So he did that. He identified the bloodline that he wanted to use, and he put in place all the omens to get this prince on the throne. But he wanted some serious protection for the kid, and so he hired a mercenary company, and he hired the Silver Dagger Mercenary Company. Okay, cool. So the Silver Daggers were instrumental in putting the prince on the throne and in filling the throne. After the prince became the king, he banned all mercenary companies except the Silver Daggers, because obviously these were huge military forces in his kingdom. He couldn't afford to have these mercenary companies available to his enemies, not all of whom rolled over just because he's the God-touched king. Then it was his grandson who actually disbanded the Silver Daggers themselves. Now, because they had been so instrumental in solving the kingdom's problems, he didn't completely outlaw them. But what he said was that Silver Daggers could only ride together in pairs or at most trios. So that made it so that the Silver Daggers were no longer a mercenary company. They were now the refuge of an outlaw man. If you were an outlaw, you could find another Silver Dagger. You could ride with them for a while and prove that you still had some modicum of honor, that your word could be trusted. If that Silver Dagger approved of you, he would then take you to one of the smiths who make these Silver Daggers, and he would swear you to the band and see to it that you had your own Silver Dagger made. And that would then result in you being a Silver Dagger, an outlaw man who hires your sword out for service, a mercenary, but one who is trusted to keep his word. And that's what the Silver Daggers mean. So this was a very loose organization of fighting men, of adventurers who hired themselves out to various lords. And what the Silver Dagger means is that they can be trusted to honor their word. And that is how you could get from a mercenary company to a more adventurer structured organization that is a loose kind of, not exactly a guild, but at least a shared set of values. So if you enjoyed that exploration of mercenary guild to adventurer, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about that Eberron guild that I was talking about. Now, in a more D&D style of world, where you have adventurers who are better than common people at dealing with certain kinds of problems, people who go out and beat up monsters for their loot, or people who solve bandit problems, or otherwise are, role-playing, adventuring types, you could have something like an adventurer's guild. So in the world of Eberron, there is such a guild. These are professional adventurers who pool their resources and their contacts. They provide guild halls where adventurers can stay. They provide certain stores and services, things like identify magic items or even purchase of some magical equipment, or potentially working through the guild to get magical equipment made for cheaper prices with the other guilds. They also provide a means to get in touch with people who need adventurers. So you can have anything here from like a board that has jobs on it to, people who come to the guild specifically to say, I have a really dangerous job, I need these kinds of people. Now, for the services, the Eberron guilds charge annual dues, and you require the approval of the kind of ranking members of the guild. You can also, in this case, have guild politics between different adventuring guilds where they could either work together or they could be rivals and try and outdo each other at every time and, have like them send adventurers against adventurers to fight for like dominance and supremacy in a city, which could make for a very interesting and conflict setup. So, how do you make your own in your fantasy world? And why would you? Well, the benefit of an adventuring guild or even just a loose association is that it gives you a place to draw characters from that move from place to place and solve problems. It gives you a way to have a character that is an outsider to society, so they can move around more freely, but is still trusted by society due to their affiliation with an organization that society trusts. So the real question is, do you need an adventurer type in your world? Do you need to have your character move around in different places and interacting with different people? If the answer is yes, potentially an adventurer type guild or association can provide you with a very smooth, organic way of having that character be trusted in the different cities and areas that they go to. Okay, cool. So maybe you do have an adventurer guild. First, you need to ask yourself, is it a loose affiliation or is it an actual formal guild? If it's a loose affiliation, how do people join? Why would they join? Like, what do they get from joining? What are the principles of this loose association? What does it mean if you're a silver dagger? Does it mean you're honorable? Does it mean you can be asked to do anything? Does it mean you're a thief? What does it mean? And how are those principles enforced? If you are found out to have lied, would the other silver daggers hunt you down? Would they come and strip your dagger away from you? How would it work? And if you go for a more formal guild, what does that guild offer? What is required for you to join? What are the penalties for not joining? Remember, guilds often enforced membership by making it untenable not to be part of them. Does the Adventurer Guild do that? Are you just frozen out of all jobs if you don't join the guild? And then, of course, with such organizations comes rivalry and inter-guild politics, which always provides you with fun threads to pull on if you need additional stories. And those are my thoughts on adventuring guilds in a fantasy world. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button and maybe check out my video on creating a thieves guild in a fantasy world. And if you want to connect around this or any other topics, remember that I do have a Discord server, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.